They say revenge is a dish best served cold. But I prefer mine scorching hot and delivered with a side of public humiliation. My name is Catherine Mills, and 6 months ago, I was just another faceless employee at Morrison & Associates, a mid-sized consulting firm downtown. Today, I'm the woman who brought down the most arrogant executive in the company's history. This is the story of how I turned my termination into his total destruction. It all started on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other. The coffee was bitter, the elevator was broken, and I was already running late for the weekly department meeting. I had no idea that within the next 4 hours, my entire life would be turned upside down by a man who thought he was untouchable. But Marcus Thornfield didn't know about my little secret. He didn't know that for the past 2 years, I'd been quietly documenting every single one of his illegal activities, every underhanded deal, every moment of harassment he thought went unnoticed. He fired me thinking I was powerless, just another disposable employee. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. I've been working at Morrison & Associates for 3 years, starting as a junior analyst fresh out of college. The company specialized in corporate restructuring and financial consulting, with clients ranging from small businesses to Fortune 500 companies. It was the kind of place where ambition and ruthlessness were rewarded, where climbing the corporate ladder often meant stepping on anyone who got in your way. My department was strategic planning, and I reported directly to Marcus Thornfield, Senior Vice President of Operations. Marcus was 42 years old, devastatingly handsome in that polished corporate way, and absolutely convinced of his own brilliance. He had piercing blue eyes, silver-streaked hair that he kept perfectly styled, and the kind of confident smile that made clients trust him implicitly. He was also a complete sociopath. From my very first day, Marcus made it clear that he expected nothing short of perfection from his team. He was demanding, condescending, and had a particular talent for making people feel worthless with just a few carefully chosen words. But I was determined to succeed. So I put up with his impossible deadlines, his public humiliations, and his tendency to take credit for other people's work. The first incident happened about 18 months into my employment. I'd been working on a major proposal for Westbrook Industries, a manufacturing company looking to streamline their operations. The proposal was my baby. I'd spent weeks researching their business model, analyzing their financial statements, and developing a comprehensive restructuring plan that would save them millions while preserving jobs. The day before the presentation, Marcus called me into his office. "Catherine," he said, not bothering to look up from his computer. "I've reviewed your work on the Westbrook proposal. It's adequate, but it needs my personal touch to really shine." "I appreciate any feedback you might have," I replied, maintaining my professional composure despite the insult. "Oh, I'm not giving you feedback. I'm taking over the presentation entirely. You can attend, but I'll be handling all client interactions." He finally looked up, that smug smile spreading across his face. This is too important to leave to a junior analyst. I felt my face flush with anger, but I kept my voice steady. "Sir, I've been working on this project for months. I know every detail, every number, and now I know them too," he interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "That's what good leadership looks like. Catherine, taking responsibility for your team's success." The next day, I sat in the conference room and watched Marcus deliver my presentation word for word, complete with my analysis, my charts, and my recommendations. The clients were impressed, asking detailed questions that Marcus answered using my research. When they signed the contract 3 days later, Marcus received a $50,000 bonus and a commendation from the company's board of directors. That night, I went home to my small apartment and made a decision that would change everything. If Marcus was going to steal my work, I was going to start keeping detailed records. I created encrypted files on my personal laptop, documenting dates, times, and conversations. I started saving emails, recording phone calls, legally, of course. I checked the state laws thoroughly, and keeping copies of all my original work. What I discovered over the following months was far worse than simple credit theft. Marcus wasn't just stealing ideas from his subordinates, he was actively defrauding clients, manipulating financial projections, and engaging in what could only be described as systematic embezzlement. The Westbrook deal was just the beginning. 6 months later, I uncovered evidence that Marcus had been inflating billable hours across multiple accounts, charging clients for work that was never performed. He'd created a network of shell companies that existed only on paper, billing clients for subcontractor services that were never rendered. The money was being funneled through a series of offshore accounts that ultimately led back to his personal finances. Then there was the Henderson Group incident. Henderson was a family-owned restaurant chain looking to expand into new markets. Marcus convinced them to invest in a series of properties that he claimed were prime real estate opportunities. What he didn't tell them was that he had a financial stake in the real estate company selling those properties. He was essentially using his position at Morrison & Associates to steer clients toward investments that would personally benefit him. The most damning evidence came from his treatment of junior employees, particularly the women. Marcus had a pattern of promising promotions and opportunities in exchange for what he euphemistically called loyalty demonstrations. When employees refused his advances, they suddenly found themselves facing poor performance reviews, impossible deadlines, and eventual termination. I documented everything, every forged signature, every manipulated financial report, every uncomfortable conversation where Marcus made it clear that career advancement came with a price. I had audio recordings, email chains, financial records, and witness statements from former employees who had been too afraid to speak up while they were still with the company. The irony was that Marcus actually liked me, in his twisted way. He saw me as competent and useful, someone who could handle the technical aspects of his schemes while remaining naive enough not to recognize what was really happening. He would often compliment my work, tell me I had a bright future with the company, and hint that there might be opportunities for advancement if I continued to prove myself valuable. I played along perfectly. I smiled at his jokes, worked overtime without complaint, and made myself indispensable to his operation, all while secretly building a case that would eventually destroy him. The end came suddenly, as these things often do. It was a Thursday morning in March, and I was reviewing the quarterly financial reports when I noticed something odd. The numbers for the Peterson manufacturing account didn't match the files I had on my personal system. According to Marcus's report, we had billed Peterson for 847 hours of consulting services in the previous quarter. According to my records, we had only performed 312 hours of actual work. I spent the rest of the day cross-referencing other accounts. And the pattern became clear. Marcus was systematically overbilling clients, sometimes by as much as 300%. The extra money was being diverted through a series of complicated transactions that eventually ended up in accounts he controlled. That evening, I stayed late to print out all the evidence. I'd been careful to keep my documentation off company servers, but I needed hard copies for what I was planning to do next. I was just finishing up when I heard footsteps in the hallway. "Catherine?" Marcus's voice carried that tone of surprise that wasn't quite genuine. "What are you doing here so late?" I looked up to find him standing in the doorway of my cubicle, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up. In his hands was a stack of papers, the same financial reports I'd been reviewing earlier. "Just catching up on some work," I replied, casually sliding my printed documents into a manila folder. "You know how it is." He stepped closer, and I noticed his eyes were focused on the papers I was trying to hide. "What kind of work? It's nearly 10 o'clock. "Just reviewing some client files, making sure everything is accurate for the quarterly review." I stood up, hoping to create some distance between us, but he moved to block my path. "Let me see those files," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I'm sorry. The papers you just put in that folder, I want to see them." His friendly facade was cracking, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. I felt my heart rate spike, but I kept my expression neutral. "These are just my personal notes. Nothing that would interest you." "Catherine, I'm going to ask you one more time. Show me those papers." We stared at each other for a long moment, and I knew my time was up. Marcus had realized that I knew something, and there was no going back to the careful game we'd been playing. "No," I said simply. His face went through several expressions in quick succession: surprise, anger, and then something that looked almost like respect. "You've been documenting my activities," he said. It wasn't a question. "I've been doing my job, which includes ensuring accuracy in our financial reporting." He laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. "Oh, Catherine, you have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. Do you think anyone is going to believe you? Do you think anyone is going to care about the accusations of a disgruntled junior analyst? I think the evidence speaks for itself." "What evidence? Your word against mine? Your interpretation of perfectly legitimate business practices?" He shook his head, that smug smile returning. "You're going to give me those files, and then you're going to forget whatever you think you've discovered. In return, I'll pretend this conversation never happened. And if I refuse? Then you'll be cleaning out your desk tomorrow morning, and I'll make sure that every consulting firm in the city knows exactly why you were terminated. Good luck finding another job in this industry with that kind of reputation." I looked at him for a long moment, weighing my options. Then I did something that surprised both of us. I smiled. "You know what, Marcus? You're absolutely right. I am just a junior analyst. My word probably wouldn't carry much weight against someone with your reputation and connections." Relief washed over his face. "I'm glad you're being reasonable about this. But here's the thing you don't understand," I continued, my smile widening. "I've never been particularly reasonable, and I definitely don't respond well to threats." Before he could react, I brushed past him and headed for the elevator. Behind me, I heard him shout my name, but I didn't turn around. I had work to do, and only a few hours to do it. The next morning, I arrived at the office early and went straight to Marcus's office. His assistant hadn't arrived yet, so I knocked on his door and waited. "Come in," he called out, and I stepped inside to find him sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, looking like he hadn't slept all night. "Catherine," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "I trust you've had time to think about our conversation last night." "I have?" I sat down in the chair across from his desk and placed my purse on the floor beside me. "I've made my decision." And I reached into my purse and pulled out a single sheet of paper, which I placed on his desk. "That's my resignation letter. I'm giving you 2 weeks' notice, effective immediately." He picked up the letter and read it quickly, his expression shifting from confusion to suspicion. "This is very sudden. Catherine, are you sure you've thought this through?" "Completely sure. I've realized that Morrison & Associates isn't the right fit for me. I need to work somewhere that aligns better with my values." "Your values," he repeated, and I could hear the sarcasm in his voice. "How noble of you. And what about our conversation last night? What about those files you were so reluctant to share?" "What files? I have no idea what you're talking about." We stared at each other across his desk, and I watched as understanding dawned in his eyes. He knew I was playing a game, but he couldn't figure out what it was. The smart thing would have been to let me leave quietly, to accept my resignation and hope that whatever I knew would leave with me. But Marcus had never been as smart as he thought he was. "You know what, Catherine? I don't think 2 weeks is necessary. In fact, I think it would be better for everyone if you left immediately." "I'm sorry?" "You're fired, effective immediately. Security will escort you to your desk to collect your personal belongings, and then you'll be escorted from the building. Your final paycheck will be mailed to you within the week." I blinked, feigning surprise. "You're firing me? But I just offered to resign." "I don't want your resignation. I want you gone. Now." He reached for his phone. "Security? Yes. I need an escort to the strategic planning department. We have a terminated employee who needs to be removed from the premises." 20 minutes later, I was standing on the sidewalk outside Morrison & Associates, carrying a small cardboard box containing my personal effects. Marcus had watched from his office window as security walked me to my car, that smug smile plastered across his face. He thought he'd won. He thought he'd successfully neutralized a threat and eliminated a problem. What he didn't know was that I had been hoping he would fire me. In fact, I had been counting on it. You see, there's a significant difference between quitting your job and being wrongfully terminated. When you quit, You have no legal recourse, no claim for unemployment benefits, and no standing to file complaints with regulatory agencies. But when you're fired, especially when you're fired for refusing to participate in illegal activities, you suddenly have a whole range of options available to you. I drove home and spent the rest of the day putting my plan into motion. First, I filed for unemployment benefits, making sure to document that I had been terminated without cause. Then I called the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to report the sexual harassment I had witnessed and documented. After that, I contacted the Securities and Exchange Commission to report the financial fraud I had uncovered. But the most important call was to Jennifer Martinez, an investigative journalist at the city's largest newspaper. Jennifer had made a name for herself exposing corporate corruption, and I had a feeling she would be very interested in the story I had to tell. We met at a coffee shop downtown the next morning. Jennifer was younger than I had expected, probably in her early 30s, with sharp eyes and the kind of energy that suggested she was always on the hunt for the next big story. "You said you had information about financial fraud at Morrison & Associates?" she asked without preamble. "I have documentation of systematic embezzlement, client fraud, and securities violations spanning the past 2 years," I replied, sliding a thick folder across the table. "Everything you need to verify is in there." She opened the folder and began scanning the documents, her eyebrows rising higher with each page. "This is extensive. How did you obtain all of this?" "I've been documenting everything for months. I knew something was wrong, but I needed proof before I could act." I leaned forward. "The man responsible for all of this is Marcus Thornfield, Senior Vice President of Operations. He fired me yesterday when he realized I was onto him." "Are you prepared to go on the record with this information?" "Absolutely. I have audio recordings, financial documents, email chains, and witness statements. I also have evidence that this isn't just financial fraud. There's a pattern of sexual harassment and retaliation against employees who don't comply with his demands." Jennifer closed the folder and looked at me with something approaching awe. "Catherine, do you realize what you have here? This isn't just a story about one corrupt executive. This is a story about systematic corporate fraud that could implicate the entire company leadership." "I know. That's why I came to you." She pulled out her phone and started making notes. "I'm going to need to verify everything independently, but if even half of this is accurate, it's going to be front-page news. How soon can you make yourself available for a formal interview?" "Whenever you need me. I have nothing but time now." The article ran 3 weeks later, and it was everything I had hoped for, and more. The headline read, "Morrison & Associates Executive Accused of Multi-Million-Dollar Fraud Scheme." The story detailed Marcus's embezzlement operation, his manipulation of client accounts, and his pattern of sexual harassment. But the most damaging part was the sidebar story about how the company had fired me immediately after I discovered evidence of the fraud. The reaction was swift and devastating. Morrison & Associates' stock price plummeted 30% in the first day of trading after the article was published. Several major clients announced they were terminating their contracts and demanding audits of all work performed by the company. The FBI opened an investigation into the financial fraud allegations, and the SEC announced they were reviewing the company's public filings for the past 5 years. But the best part was Marcus's response. Instead of keeping quiet and letting his lawyers handle the situation, he decided to go on the offensive. He called Jennifer Martinez and demanded that she print a retraction, claiming that I was a disgruntled employee who had fabricated evidence to get revenge for being fired. Catherine Mills was terminated for poor performance and insubordination, he told the reporter. "She's clearly fabricated these allegations as a way to damage the company and my reputation. I categorically deny all of these baseless accusations." Jennifer, being the professional she was, included his comments in a follow-up article. But she also included something else, excerpts from the audio recordings I had made, including one particularly damning conversation where Marcus explicitly discussed how to hide overbilling from clients. The second article was even more devastating than the first. Marcus's own words, recorded in his own voice, provided irrefutable evidence of his guilt. Within hours of the article's publication, Morrison and Associates announced that Marcus had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. 2 days later, he was arrested. I watched the news coverage from my apartment, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and vindication that was almost intoxicating. The man who had made my life miserable for 3 years, who had stolen credit for my work and threatened to destroy my career, was being led away in handcuffs while reporters shouted questions at him. But the story didn't end there. Marcus's arrest was just the beginning of a much larger investigation that eventually implicated 6 other Morrison and Associates executives. The FBI uncovered a conspiracy that had been operating for nearly a decade, involving not just embezzlement and fraud, but money laundering, tax evasion, and racketeering. The company itself was ultimately fined $47 million and forced to pay restitution to the clients who had been defrauded. Several executives received prison sentences, with Marcus getting the longest term, 12 years in federal prison. As for me, I became something of a celebrity in the corporate whistleblower community. I was invited to speak at conferences, testified before congressional committees, and eventually wrote a book about my experience. The legal settlement I received from Morrison and Associates was substantial enough that I didn't have to work for several years, but I eventually started my own consulting firm specializing in corporate ethics and compliance. The most satisfying moment came about 6 months after Marcus's arrest. I received a call from David Morrison, the company's founder and CEO. He wanted to meet with me personally to apologize for what had happened and to discuss the possibility of me returning to the company in a senior leadership role. We met at the same coffee shop where I had first talked to Jennifer Martinez. David was in his 70s, a distinguished man who had built Morrison and Associates from nothing into a major player in the consulting industry. He looked tired and defeated, aged by the scandal that had nearly destroyed his life's work. "Catherine," he said as we sat down, "I owe you an apology. What happened to you was inexcusable, and I take full responsibility for creating an environment where someone like Marcus could operate with impunity. I appreciate that, Mr. Morrison. But I have to ask, how much did you know about what was happening?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. I knew Marcus was aggressive, demanding. I knew he had a reputation for being difficult to work with. But I never imagined. He looked up at me. I had no idea about the fraud. "Catherine, if I had known, I would have stopped it immediately. And the harassment? The retaliation against employees who wouldn't comply with his demands? I heard rumors, but whenever I tried to investigate, the complaints would be withdrawn. People were afraid to speak up, afraid of losing their jobs. I should have done more to protect them." We talked for another hour, and I could see that David was genuinely remorseful about what had happened. He offered me a position as Vice President of Ethics and Compliance, with a salary that was more than double what I had been making as a junior analyst. He also offered to implement new policies and procedures to prevent the kind of abuse that had driven me to become a whistleblower. I thanked him for the offer, but I turned it down. I had learned something important about myself during those difficult months. I was stronger than I had ever imagined, and I didn't need anyone else's validation or approval to succeed. Instead, I started my own company, specializing in helping other whistleblowers navigate the complex legal and emotional challenges of exposing corporate corruption. My first client was a former Morrison and Associates employee who had evidence of additional fraud that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. The work was deeply satisfying in a way that my previous job had never been. Instead of helping companies maximize profits, I was helping individuals find the courage to speak truth to power. Instead of covering up problems, I was exposing them to the light of day. Marcus, meanwhile, was having a very different experience. Prison was not kind to him. The man who had once commanded respect through fear and intimidation found himself at the mercy of people who were not impressed by his corporate credentials. He was attacked twice in his first year, once seriously enough to require hospitalization. His wife divorced him 6 months into his sentence, taking half of his remaining assets and full custody of their 2 children. His house was sold to pay legal fees and restitution. His reputation, which he had spent decades building, was permanently destroyed. I received occasional updates about his situation through contacts in the legal community. He had tried to appeal his conviction multiple times, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. He had attempted to negotiate a reduced sentence by providing information about other corrupt executives, but the prosecutors already had most of the information he offered. The last I heard, he was working in the prison library, helping other inmates prepare legal documents. It was a fitting end for someone who had spent so much of his career manipulating legal and financial systems for his own benefit. As I write this, it's been 2 years since Marcus was arrested, and my life has stabilized into something I never could have imagined when I was sitting in that cubicle, documenting his crimes and wondering if I would ever have the courage to act on what I knew. My consulting firm has grown to 12 employees, and we're working on cases across the country. We've helped expose fraud at 3 major corporations, assisted in the prosecution of 7 executives, and recovered more than $23 million in stolen funds for victims of corporate crime. But the most important thing I've learned is that revenge, real revenge, isn't about hurting the people who hurt you. It's about building something better from the ashes of what they tried to destroy. Marcus thought he could break me, could intimidate me into silence and complicity. Instead, he gave me the motivation to become the person I was always meant to be. Every morning when I arrive at my office, I pass a framed copy of the newspaper article that started it all. It's a reminder of where I came from and of the power that comes from refusing to be a victim. The headline still makes me smile. Morrison and Associates executive accused of multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. But there's another headline that means even more to me. From an article that ran 6 months later. Former whistleblower starts consulting firm to help other corporate crime victims. That's the headline that tells the real story. Not the story of how Marcus Thornfield fell from grace, but the story of how Catherine Mills rose from the ashes of her former life to build something meaningful and lasting. Marcus fired me thinking he was ending my story. Instead, he gave me the perfect beginning for a much better one. And that, I think, is the sweetest revenge of all. The irony isn't lost on me that the man who tried to destroy my career ultimately became the catalyst for my greatest success. He thought he was protecting himself by eliminating a threat, but he was actually creating his own downfall. Every document I had gathered, every recording I had made, every piece of evidence I had collected became a weapon in the fight for justice. In the end, Marcus's greatest mistake wasn't the fraud itself, or even the harassment and intimidation. His greatest mistake was underestimating the quiet woman in the cubicle who had been watching, listening, and preparing. He saw me as weak, disposable, insignificant. He never imagined that I could be the instrument of his destruction. But I was, and I am. And every day, I work to make sure that other victims of corporate abuse have the same opportunity to turn their pain into power, their silence into strength, and their fear into the kind of courage that changes everything. Marcus Thornfield thought he fired an employee. Instead, he created an enemy. And in the world of corporate warfare, there's no more dangerous adversary than someone who has nothing left to lose and everything to gain from telling the truth. That's the real secret weapon he never saw coming, not just the evidence I had gathered, but the unbreakable will of someone who refused to be broken. He discovered too late that you can't destroy what you don't understand, and he never understood the kind of person I really was. Now he has 12 years in prison to think about that mistake. And I have the rest of my life to make sure it was worth it.